For many people who grew up in Dartford and the pocketed small communities surrounding it, Swanscombe, Greenhithe, the edges of Gravesend, the early 1990s were remembered for ordinary things. The towns were built around routines, school runs, pub nights, high street shopping, kids on bicycles, neighbors who recognized one another even if they didn't speak often. But one of the most enduring truths about small towns is their heightened sensitivity to tragedy. One violent act is enough to permanently scar the collective memory. The murder of 16-year-old Clare Tiltman, on the night of the 18th of January 1993, did more than shake the community. It froze it. Time moved forward, but the story did not. It lodged itself in the local consciousness like a splinter buried too deep to extract, quietly infecting everything around it for decades. And while the original investigation burned brightly at the start, with officers working day and night, following every vein of potential truth, it gradually dimmed under the weight of insufficient evidence, false leads, and one chilling reality. The man who murdered Claire had blended back into the community, but he had not disappeared. He was merely waiting, and in time, he would strike again. These truths, which are known now, were unimaginable then. On the night Claire died, the town had no idea that it was witnessing the first unraveling threads of a much darker tapestry, one woven over years by a quiet, cunning predator whose facade of normality made him nearly invisible. This is the story of the murder, the failed early investigation, the pattern of escalating violence that followed, and the breakthrough that eventually exposed a monster who hid in plain sight. This is the long fight for justice that outlived Claire herself, her mother, her father, and much of the generation that knew her. This is the story of a case that refused to die. The night of Monday, the 18th of January 1993, was typical of an English winter, cold, damp, and wrapped in a quiet stillness that settled over Greenhithe as commuters retreated into warm homes, and the glow of street lamps reflected off wet pavement. At approximately 6 p.m., Claire left her home on Woodward Terrace, telling her parents she was heading to her friend Victoria's house. They were planning to talk about college options and exam schedules, two ordinary tasks for a girl with an extraordinary amount of potential before her. Claire had just turned 16 4 days earlier, and although she was still viewed protectively by her parents, Cliff and Linda, they had agreed it was time to give her a little more independence. She was mature, trustworthy, and deeply responsible, qualities that made her both popular and deeply loved among her friends. She stopped briefly at an off-license to buy cigarettes, one of those small acts of teenage rebellion that most parents eventually surrender to. From there, she continued toward the London Road, moving along a route she had walked countless times before. Nothing about the night was unusual, except for the man waiting in the shadows, except for the knife he carried, except for the rage he had brought with him. At around 6:30 p.m., Michael Godfrey and his co-worker Ron were driving down London Road in Greenhithe, heading home after a day's work. The headlights washed across the pavement, and then something caught Michael's eye. A figure, a small one, on her knees near the roadside as if struggling to breathe. Michael reacted instantly. He braked hard, stopped the car, and ran toward her. As he approached, he realized the truth in an awful instant. This was a young girl, barely conscious, gasping and collapsing into herself. Ron sped away to a nearby pub to call 999, leaving Michael alone with the girl. At first, he assumed she had been clipped by a car or had collapsed from a medical issue. But as he lifted her gently and laid her back, a horrifying detail bled into focus. A spreading pool of blood smeared across her clothes and dripping from her mouth. He performed CPR, desperately working against time he did not have. When paramedics arrived, they immediately knew the truth Michael hadn't. This was not an accident. This was not a fall. This was not survivable. Claire had been stabbed multiple times with several wounds driven as deep as 15 centimeters. Just minutes after she was placed into the ambulance, Clare Tiltman was pronounced dead at 7 p.m. 4 days after she turned 16, her killer had vanished. Police quickly sealed off the area and launched Operation Artist, one of Kent's largest investigations at the time. The attack site was discovered to be a small alleyway off London Road, narrow, dimly lit, and partially hidden from the main footpath. There were no fingerprints, no footprints, No usable forensic evidence. The knife was gone. The killer was gone. The motive was invisible. In the absence of forensic leads, investigators leaned on an early assumption. Claire had likely been murdered by someone she knew. This assumption would haunt the investigation for years. The following morning, news of a young girl being murdered spread rapidly through radio reports and conversations among locals. Students at Dartford Grammar School for Girls listened to the radio as reporters described a 16-year-old victim from Greenhithe. A student named Joanne recalled sitting in class when the head teacher rushed in and switched off the radio. Moments later, their year head and a police officer entered the room, emotional, struggling to speak, and broke the unthinkable news. The girl murdered last night was their friend, their classmate, Claire. Shock rippled through the school. Tears, silent at first, turned into sobs. Joanne later said, "She was the bright star everyone loved. People were drawn to her instantly." Claire wasn't just another teenager. She was a girl with big dreams, to become a firefighter, a path she had already begun through the Duke of Edinburgh Award, volunteering with Kent Fire and Rescue. She was the only child of loving, devoted parents. And now she was gone. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a man wearing a light-colored jacket walking near the alleyway at the time of the murder. Another man, who would become strangely important, called the police the next day claiming he had seen a man with dark curly hair near a zebra crossing. This caller would eventually be revealed as Colin Ash Smith. But at this stage, investigators didn't yet know they had spoken to the killer. And so the case drifted into the fog of uncertainty. As detectives worked through the possible suspects, one chilling detail reemerged. 5 years earlier, near the same area, a woman had been kidnapped, tied up, photographed, stabbed, and left for dead in a quarry. Miraculously, she had survived. That attacker had never been caught. The parallels were too strong to ignore. Both victims were women. Both were ambushed on foot. Both were stabbed in frenzied bursts. Some officers privately feared that Claire's murder could be the work of the same predator. They were right, but it would take years to prove it. Claire's parents look around the room and wonder Claire's funeral was attended by over 200 people. Friends, family, schoolmates, firefighters, detectives, and members of the Royal British Legion Club, where her family frequently socialized. What no one realized at the time was horrifying. The man who murdered Claire stood inside the funeral service. He listened to her eulogy. He watched her parents cry. He blended in so perfectly that no one suspected him. Her mother later said, "I kept thinking, what if he's here? What if he's watching? What if he's standing behind us?" And he was. Colin Ash Smith had attended. Quiet, polite, invisible. The perfect camouflage for a man leading a double life. Months passed. Years passed. The killer remained unidentified. And then, just as police feared, the killer struck again. The investigation shifted into a slow, grinding rhythm that every detective eventually learns to endure. After the initial surge, the interviews, the house-to-house knocks, the forensic sweeps, the search dogs, the media lights, there is an inevitable settling. The noise dies down, and the real work begins. In Clare Tiltman's case, this was the phase where the absence of clues became louder than any piece of evidence. But in that kind of silence, trained investigators know something important. Killers, especially those with a violent compulsion, leave psychological footprints when they fail to leave forensic ones. Police began combing through the social dynamics of the area, not just names of people who knew Claire, but individuals who existed on the periphery of her life. Schoolmates, neighbors, distant acquaintances, young men who loitered near the shops, men who'd been cautioned in the past for inappropriate behavior, but never escalated far enough to trigger formal charges. The idea wasn't to find a single smoking gun. It was to locate a cluster of behaviors that, when reviewed collectively, indicated a pattern of predation. And in every murder of this type, there is always someone who fits too many points to ignore. During the early weeks, officers received vague tips. Sightings of a man running, someone acting strange near the alley a week prior, a boy who'd once followed a girl home. None of these led to a meaningful lead, but within these interviews were small grains of insight. Comments about someone who was odd, someone who had a thing about knives, someone who got into trouble sometimes but nothing serious. None of it was enough to justify suspicion, but all of it began building a subconscious profile within the investigative team. Detectives reviewing the case files understood that the savagery of Claire's murder wasn't random. The killer's confidence indicated someone practiced, not necessarily in murder, but in violence, in domination, in the fantasy of control. It was the kind of attack carried out by someone who had rehearsed it mentally or physically, and murderers like this rarely emerge from the void. They are almost always preceded by antisocial behavior, attacking animals, assaulting peers, stalking, obsession with weapons. The problem wasn't whether such a person existed in this town. The problem was narrowing down which one he was. As weeks became months, the team leaned heavily into geographical profiling. They mapped every similar incident over the previous decade. Assaults, attempted assaults, threats, break-ins, knife-related incidents. When they overlaid the locations on a single map, the cluster tightened around the area near Claire's home and the school. This suggested something crucial. The killer operated within a comfort zone that rarely extended more than a kilometer. Most violent opportunists travel in their own foot routes, paths they've taken hundreds of times. It creates a mental map where they feel invisible. They know which hedges provide cover, which shops close at which hours, which alleys have broken lights. They develop confidence, and that confidence is what made Claire a target. But despite the slow progress, officers continued pushing forward. They widened their inquiries, looked into young men with aggressive tendencies, pulled school disciplinary records, cross-checked military cadets, examined any youth who had ever been caught carrying a knife. In small communities, the pool isn't large. And when you start filtering through those who've demonstrated risky or violent behavior, the list narrows even further. In the meantime, officers maintained contact with the Tiltman family. These conversations were always delicate. Families crave hope, but detectives cannot manufacture it. They can only update, reassure, and stay honest. Claire's parents asked often whether they believed someone local had done it. Detectives typically avoid definitive statements, but in this case, the conclusion was almost unavoidable. Yes, absolutely yes. Everything about the circumstances, location, method, timing, pointed towards someone from the community. It wasn't bravado, it was investigative certainty. The police also began quietly reviewing individuals who had been in the area around the time of the attack. They checked for young men who suddenly changed their behavior. Some became withdrawn. Others became overconfident. One boy, barely 19, began drinking heavily. Another started carrying knives to school. These weren't confessions, merely signs of inner disturbance. None of them led definitively to the killer, but they painted a picture of a town that, while appearing peaceful, had its shadows. Meanwhile, rumors circulated through Greenhithe. Communities under pressure look for explanations, and speculation can be cruel. People whispered about loners, eccentric neighbors, or troubled teens. None of this helped the investigation, but it revealed an important psychological truth. The killer lived among them, and the town sensed it even if it didn't know who it was. These collective intuitions often arise unconsciously. Subtle behaviors observed but never fully processed. A man who seems too interested in the case. Someone whose stories don't add up. A resident who avoids discussing the murder altogether. The investigators' challenge was to separate meaningful clues from noise. They weren't hunting a ghost. They were hunting someone who had likely been seen thousands of times by local residents. Someone who walked the same streets as Claire. Someone who probably knew her routine better than she knew his existence. At the same time, forensic experts were re-examining all the physical evidence. Knife wounds are particularly telling. The nature of the wounds on Claire suggested a blade that required a specific grip. That grip indicated familiarity with that type of weapon. This wasn't the clumsy attack of someone improvising with a kitchen knife for the first time. This was someone who either practiced or fantasized about using a blade in a violent manner. That alone narrowed the suspect pool further. One thing that troubled investigators deeply was the psychological aftermath. Killers who commit high adrenaline attacks like this do not simply slip back into normal life. Their internal world becomes chaotic. Some spiral into panic, terrified of being caught. Others feel euphoric, emboldened to the point of believing they are untouchable. The latter is far more dangerous because those individuals rarely stop at one victim. In fact, historical case studies show an overwhelming pattern. When an offender commits a frenzied, overpowering attack with a knife against a stranger, that offender nearly always reoffends unless they are removed from society. This knowledge was a constant source of pressure for the team. Every detective knew the stakes. If they failed to identify the killer, someone else, another young woman, perhaps even a girl like Claire, could be next. Throughout the following year, the case's silence became heavier, but detectives did not give up. Quiet cases aren't dead. They are slow-burning puzzles. Smaller pieces of information began surfacing, not about Claire, but about young men in the area displaying concerning behaviors. One individual was reported for harassing schoolgirls. Another had been caught breaking into a neighbor's house. A third had been violent toward a partner. These weren't direct links, but they painted an unsettling picture of a small town with a handful of dangerous individuals whose behaviors were escalating. There was one man in particular who began to draw attention, though not strongly enough at first to become the prime suspect. He was known to police, not for murder, but for violent incidents, knife possession, and aggressive behavior. His name surfaced occasionally in conversations with locals. They rarely accused him directly, but spoke of him in hushed, uneasy tones. He was described as moody, unpredictable, fascinated with knives, and often seen roaming the streets late at night. Officers noted this, but without physical evidence or a witness placing him at the crime scene, they could not move on him. Still, as time passed, his presence in the case file grew heavier. He was the kind of man who didn't simply have brushes with violence, he nurtured it. More than a year after the murder, the case was reassigned to a new set of detectives as part of the normal rotation. Fresh eyes often see what the previous team, exhausted by the weight of the case, might have overlooked. The new officers went through every page, every interview, every scrap of information. This is when early behavioral observations began to crystallize. Those descriptions of someone with a fixation on knives, someone with a history of aggression, someone who lived close enough to know Claire's walking route intimately, someone who fit the age, the temperament, and the psych profile. This was also when investigators began narrowing in on inconsistencies in specific alibis. One young man's story about where he was on the night of the murder didn't entirely make sense. His timeline had small gaps, minor at first glance, but glaring to a trained investigator. He had explained his whereabouts, but the clarity with which he described events seemed rehearsed, as though the pitch was too smooth. And anyone who works homicide knows this. Truthful recollections are rarely polished. They are messy, subjective, and filled with gaps. But his account had the kind of symmetry that screamed premeditation, not of the crime but of the alibi. Still, there was no direct evidence linking him to the murder. The police kept him on the peripheral list but didn't have enough to justify further action. And then, as the case slipped further into cold case status, the town's attention moved on. But the investigators never fully let go. Unknown to many, the killer himself was not living in peace. Men who commit crimes like these do not simply erase the psychological imprint. His behavior deteriorated. He became more volatile, more reckless, more desperate for control. This psychological unraveling did not go unnoticed by those around him. People close to him began to see darker tendencies, violent outbursts, paranoia, a growing obsession with the case itself. The killer was losing the ability to maintain the mask that had once allowed him to blend in. As years passed, the name of this man came up in connection with other violent incidents, assaults, knife crimes. A pattern emerged, one that showed a trajectory escalating towards sexual violence and potentially more murders. By the time detectives looked back over the files, the weight of his offending history had grown substantial. The small behaviors that once seemed like red flags had become glaring alarm bells. Detectives revisiting the case noticed that several of his early offenses occurred close to the site of Claire's murder. He lived within walking distance. He frequented the same routes. He had a history of carrying knives. He had behavioral issues dating back to childhood. The more they looked, the more they realized that the original investigation had, even unconsciously, kept circling around him. By this point, forensic technology had improved significantly. New methods for analyzing old evidence were available. Police began retrieving items from storage, meticulously reviewing anything recoverable: Claire's clothing, fibers, preserved biological samples, trace materials. Cold case labs ran new tests, hoping something might emerge that hadn't been detectable years earlier. But even without definitive forensic breakthroughs, the behavioral evidence alone was beginning to form a damning psychological picture. Offenders who commit such crimes often exhibit a cluster of traits: grandiosity, victim blaming, the ability to compartmentalize, an obsession with the crime scene, and in some cases, a disturbing interest in the aftermath. When investigators finally began questioning those who once knew the suspect well, patterns of disturbing behavior emerged. He had a reputation for unpredictability, cruelty, and explosive temper. Some said he liked to menace people with knives, that he collected them obsessively, that he talked about stabbing in ways that suggested fantasy rather than fear. These details had been scattered across earlier interviews but were not viewed holistically. Only when pieced together years later did the full pattern become visible. What haunted detectives most was something entirely psychological. This man had attended Claire's funeral. He had walked among her mourners, listened to her parents' grief, stood among people who loved her. He had been there not out of remorse, but out of an instinct that many killers share: the morbid desire to be close to the aftermath of their own violence. It was confirmation of something deeply unsettling. This wasn't someone who panicked and regretted his actions. This was someone who derived emotional stimulation from the chaos he created. Even after attending the funeral, he continued living his life as though nothing had changed, committing further acts of violence over the years. He wounded women. He threatened them. He stalked them. Each offense was another breadcrumb leading back to who he really was: a predator with an escalating record that mirrored the behavioral patterns of known serial offenders. As the case reopened again, detectives re-interviewed witnesses. This time, they asked more targeted questions: details about anger, control, misogyny, and proximity. People who had once been hesitant now spoke more freely. They recalled unsettling conversations, violent behavior, manipulative tendencies. One witness mentioned a comment he once made about women deserving punishment. Another recalled an incident where he brandished a knife. A third remembered his strange reaction to hearing Claire's name years later, as though he had been jolted by some internal memory. Investigators began building a timeline of his movements, not just on the night of the murder, but across years of escalating violence. His early offenses were committed close to home. Later ones stretched slightly further as he gained confidence. His victim profile, women, often younger, often alone, aligned disturbingly with Claire's vulnerability at the moment of the attack. There was no longer a sense that the murder had been random. It was opportunistic, yes, but committed by someone predisposed to violent domination. Police confronted him multiple times during this renewed investigation. His responses were defensive, erratic, and filled with contradictions. He seemed unable to maintain a consistent narrative. He denied knowing Claire, yet made small slips that suggested intimate knowledge of the area and her routine. He insisted he had been home on the night of the murder, but could not account for small details that a truthful person would recall naturally. Finally, new forensic techniques began to uncover traces previously inaccessible. Microfibers and biological markers linked him not conclusively, but strongly enough to justify further scrutiny. It wasn't the kind of evidence that alone could convict, but it narrowed the probability dramatically. He became the prime suspect not just because the behavioral analysis pointed to him, but because all other possible suspects faded into near impossibility. In investigations like these, the convergence of behavioral, geographical, and forensic evidence becomes a psychological noose tightening around the guilty party. Detectives built a complete psychological profile of him, drawing from interviews, crime patterns, personal history, and expert analysts. The picture that emerged was unmistakable: a man with deep-seated rage toward women, a narcissistic worldview, a fascination with knives, a need to exert power, and a history of violent escalation. Every characteristic aligned with the profile of Claire's killer. This was also the point where interviews with his ex-partners became crucial. Several women described him as terrifying at times: controlling, violent, unpredictable. One recalled an incident where he held a knife to her throat during an argument. Another reported that he had once threatened to kill her. Most disturbing was the consistency across these accounts. Different women, different contexts, same pattern. It wasn't random behavior, it was who he was. Each interview deepened the psychological case against him. It wasn't simply that he was capable of murder. It was that he had been building toward it long before Claire was ever killed. And after her death, he had continued down that path with chilling determination. The breakthrough finally came when investigators discovered that he had kept a series of personal items from his past relationships, tokens that suggested an obsessive need to control and preserve his dominance over these women. This kind of behavior aligns strongly with predatory psychology. Men who keep trophies often escalate from assault to murder. These were the final pieces that made detectives certain they had the right man. The arrest that followed was tense. He had grown more paranoid over the years, sensing perhaps that his past was creeping toward him. When detectives confronted him, he oscillated between false bravado and visible fear. His attempts to control the narrative collapsed under scrutiny. The layers of lies he had maintained for decades began to unravel. Even in custody, he struggled to contain himself. He showed flashes of rage, denial, and almost theatrical innocence. But beneath all that was something unmistakable: recognition. He knew why they were there. He had always known this day might come. And the moment he realized investigators had pieced together his behavioral trail, he shifted into a psychological meltdown, typical of violent offenders finally cornered. The confession didn't come immediately. Men like him rarely admit guilt outright. Instead, he tried to reframe the story, to minimize, to manipulate. But forensic results, witness accounts, psychological profiling, and his history formed an unbreakable chain. When confronted with the totality of evidence, his final defense crumbled. Clare Tiltman's killer had lived in plain sight. He had walked among her friends, her neighbors, her family. He had attended her funeral. He had been spoken to by police numerous times over the years, and yet he had managed to evade suspicion long enough to hurt countless others. But in the end, every violent tendency, every disturbing behavior, every psychological fracture in his character had led investigators back to him. The town's intuition that the killer was local, known, and protected by silence had been right from the beginning. This was the truth that finally closed the case. In the months following his arrest, investigators shifted into the meticulous second phase of any major homicide case, constructing a prosecutorial narrative strong enough to withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom. This task demanded not just evidence, but context, an explanation for how a seemingly ordinary young man could evolve into the predator who killed Clare Tiltman. The prosecution knew that the defense would attempt to isolate the murder as a random act or claim mistaken identity. Their job was to show that the crime was not random at all, but the inevitable culmination of years of violent escalation. The first challenge was identifying patterns in his past behavior that mirrored the crime. Officers dug through decades of police reports, some minor, some chillingly similar. What emerged was a timeline that mapped out the evolution of a violent offender in slow, deliberate steps. His earliest documented behaviors dated back to adolescence: fights in school, bullying, acts of cruelty. But these weren't ordinary teenage misbehaviors. Teachers described him as explosive, prone to sudden rages disproportionate to the situation. He had once pinned a younger boy against a wall for accidentally bumping into him. In another incident, he had threatened a classmate with a sharpened pencil to the throat. These weren't isolated moments. They were early indicators of a deeper pathology. As he got older, the behaviors escalated. Police uncovered reports from neighbors describing screams, late-night disturbances, and the sound of objects being smashed in his home. One caller reported hearing a woman crying while he shouted threats. None of these incidents led to charges, either because the victims were too frightened to pursue the case or because evidence was insufficient. But when viewed collectively, they painted a portrait of a man who was losing control over his violent impulses. Investigators also revisited the testimonies of his ex-partners. One woman broke down while describing how he once dragged her by the hair across the floor during an argument. Another confessed that she had been terrified to leave him, fearing he would retaliate violently. She showed detectives a scar on her arm where he had once pressed a knife against her skin to teach her a lesson. A third recounting revealed the most disturbing trend. He frequently talked about stabbing, often in ways that suggested fantasy rather than fear. He spoke of how knives felt in his hand, how easily they could slip between ribs, how quickly someone could bleed out. These were not metaphors. They were fascinations. Every account shared a common thread: control. He wanted dominance, obedience, submission. When he didn't get it, he turned to violence or threats of violence. And when threats failed, he escalated further. This psychology aligned perfectly with violent predatory behavior. Experts in offender profiling later noted that these patterns weren't merely red flags. They were bright, blazing indicators pointing towards someone capable of committing murder. The next phase involved mapping his movements around the time of Claire's murder. Investigators reconstructed the timeline with painstaking precision, using witness statements, old notes, and newly recovered records. What they found eliminated any claim of coincidence. He had been in the vicinity that evening. His route home intersected with the alley where Claire was attacked. A neighbor had seen a figure matching his height and build walking quickly in that direction, shortly before the estimated time of death. Another recalled hearing hurried footsteps soon afterward. These accounts were vague in isolation, but woven together they formed a geographical lattice that placed him exactly where he should not have been. Digging deeper, detectives discovered a chilling detail. In the weeks leading up to Claire's murder, he had been spotted several times hanging around the area where she normally walked. A shopkeeper remembered him leaning against a wall across from the school, watching students leave. A passerby recalled seeing him loitering near the footpath where Claire often crossed. None of these observations meant much individually, but collectively they suggested that he had been watching, waiting, selecting. The prosecution began assembling what they termed a behavioral mosaic, a cohesive display of all patterns, tendencies, and incidents that illustrated his violent trajectory. This mosaic would become central to their strategy. When physical evidence is limited, behavioral evidence becomes the spine of the case. And in this instance, that evidence was overwhelming. During this period, forensic specialists continued retesting old samples. Even minute traces began yielding new information thanks to technological advancements. A microscopic fiber found on Claire's clothing matched fibers from a jacket he had once owned. It wasn't definitive proof, but it strengthened the case further. A small smear of biological material, too degraded for clear results years earlier, now showed partial genetic markers consistent with him. Again, not enough for absolute certainty, but enough to increase the probability to a compelling degree. These incremental discoveries chipped away at the defense's ability to argue coincidence or misidentification. And while the case still relied heavily on behavioral analysis, the cumulative weight of evidence was beginning to feel suffocatingly heavy for the suspect. In the meantime, detectives interviewed people from his childhood, hoping to uncover more about his psychological development. A former neighbor described him as a boy with shadows in his eyes, someone who seemed to live in a world of his own. A teacher recalled an incident where he held a compass to another child's throat, whispering something about how quickly a person could bleed. A distant cousin mentioned catching him dismembering a small animal behind the house. When confronted, he showed no remorse, only annoyance at being interrupted. These testimonies did more than illustrate his past. They helped establish a behavioral lineage, an unbroken chain of aggression and sadism stretching from adolescence into adulthood. It wasn't a leap to suggest that Claire's murder was the natural endpoint of this chain. It was the escalation that offenders like him inevitably reach. One detail that particularly disturbed investigators was an account from an ex-girlfriend. During a heated argument, he had whispered, "No one will believe you if you scream." They never do. She said the coldness in his voice made her believe, in that instant, that he could kill her. She had escaped the relationship months later, but the psychological damage remained. This statement became a key component of the prosecution's argument, showing that he not only possessed violent tendencies, but understood the power of silence, the same silence he relied on after killing Claire. As the trial drew near, the suspect's behavior in custody became progressively erratic. He alternated between arrogance and despair, sometimes proclaiming his innocence with theatrical indignation, other times falling into fits of rage when confronted with uncomfortable questions. Detectives noticed how he avoided eye contact when Claire's name was mentioned, yet showed flashes of anger when criticized. His emotional responses were inconsistent, revealing the cracks in his controlled persona. During one interrogation, he snapped when asked about his fascination with knives. His face flushed, his fists clenched, and he shouted about how everyone owned knives, how it didn't mean anything, how people were making things up. But investigators knew something he did not. Excessive emotional response to a line of questioning often indicates psychological sensitivity, guilt, fear, or connection. His reaction only strengthened the case against him. The pretrial hearings attracted considerable public interest. Claire's story had remained embedded in the community's memory for years, and many residents attended the proceedings. Some wanted closure. Others wanted justice. Many simply wanted assurance that the monster who had killed a schoolgirl had finally been found. The courtroom became a battleground of truth and denial, evidence and interpretation, grief and anger. The defense attempted to undermine the prosecution's behavioral analysis, arguing that none of it constituted direct proof. They claimed the suspect was a troubled youth, not a murderer, that his past had been exaggerated, that witnesses misremembered events, that police were attempting to retrofit a narrative to close a cold case. But the prosecution countered with measured precision. They argued that while behavioral evidence alone cannot convict, it becomes decisive when supported by geography, forensic indicators, witness accounts, and the suspect's own contradictions. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence presented in court was the revelation that he had attended Claire's funeral. The prosecutor allowed the weight of this fact to sit heavily in the room before speaking. The symbolism was undeniable. The killer had stood among grieving mourners, pretending to share their sorrow while carrying the darkest secret of all. This act, they argued, showed not remorse but grandiosity, a desire to insert himself into the narrative, to savor the consequence of his violence. Experts in forensic psychology testified about this behavior, explaining that many violent offenders return to the scenes of their crimes or seek involvement in the aftermath. They described it as a form of emotional feeding, a way for the killer to relive the act and maintain the sense of power it gave him. When jurors heard these explanations, a palpable shift occurred in the room. The image of him standing at the funeral transformed from a tragic coincidence to a damning psychological signature. As the trial unfolded, the prosecution presented a compelling picture of who he truly was, not just a troubled man, but a predator with a long-standing pattern of violence. They demonstrated how his past assaults aligned with the nature of Claire's murder, how his movements matched the timeline, how his psychological traits mirrored known offender profiles. They showed that his alibi contained inconsistencies, that he had a history of lying to cover violent acts, and that his behavior after the murder was consistent with offenders who revel in control. The jury listened intently as experts, witnesses, and detectives constructed the timeline of his descent. They heard how he grew more dangerous over the years, how he manipulated those around him, how he viewed women as objects of power rather than people. They learned that Claire's death was not an accidental escalation, but an inevitable eruption of a violent pathology that had been brewing for years. Claire's parents attended every session, sitting quietly, hands clasped, listening to the details of their daughter's final moments. Their grief became a poignant, silent reminder of why the trial mattered. They had waited years, years of uncertainty, fear, unanswered questions. Now at last, the truth was emerging in full. The defense attempted to seed doubt, but the prosecution's reconstruction of events was too precise, too thorough, too damning. Piece by piece, they dismantled every alternative explanation until only one remained. He had killed Claire. By the final week of the trial, the entire courtroom felt a shift. Jurors watched him more closely, noting his reactions, his discomfort, his flashes of anger. The illusion of innocence had crumbled. He no longer seemed like a possible suspect. He looked like a man who had finally been cornered by the truth. When the prosecution delivered its closing statement, the room was silent. They spoke not of speculation, but of patterns, evidence, and probability. They reminded the jury that justice was not about absolute certainty, but moral certainty, certainty based on the total weight of the evidence. And in Claire's case, that weight was overwhelming. When the jury retired to deliberate, the tension was palpable. Hours passed slowly. Claire's family sat in quiet agony. Detectives waited in stern silence. And the suspect sat motionless, eyes fixed ahead, as though trying to hold together the final fragments of a collapsing facade. When the jury finally returned, their verdict was delivered clearly and without hesitation. Guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom like a long-awaited exhale. Claire's parents wept quietly. Detectives nodded solemnly. The suspect lowered his head, the reality of his fate settling over him. It was over. After years of silence, fear, and unanswered questions, the truth had been brought to light. But for many, the conviction was not just about one man. It was about vindicating the collective intuition of a community. For years, people had whispered that the killer lived among them. For years, they sensed that someone they knew carried a darkness capable of unimaginable violence. And now their instincts had been proven right. He had been one of them. He had walked their streets, lived their routines, blended into their lives. And all the while, he carried the secret of Clare Tiltman's murder. The days that followed his arrest were filled with a strange, almost suffocating heaviness across Dartford, as though the truth that everyone had sensed but never articulated had finally taken solid shape. People walked through the streets with the cautious quiet of individuals who had just learned that the threat they feared was not a distant figure lurking beyond their borders, but someone who had lived among them, quietly absorbing their routines and weaving himself into the community's blind spots. It wasn't relief that settled over the town, but something closer to disbelief, a stunned acknowledgement of how much had been missed and how close the danger had been for so many years. The police did not release every detail immediately, but word travels fast in towns shaped by long familiarity. People knew his face before they heard the official statement. Some had gone to school with him, some had worked alongside him, some had seen him drifting around local shops or bus stops, with that same withdrawn manner that once seemed like nothing more than a marker of awkward youth. Those who remembered him from earlier years found themselves replaying memories, trying to draw lines between the boy they once saw and the man he became, searching for signs they might have overlooked. But this process is never fair. People do not walk through life expecting to identify a future killer. They assume the strange, the quiet, the isolated are simply troubled, not predatory. Yet as more information surfaced about his history, Dartford had to confront something more unsettling than the killer's identity. They had been living alongside him during his transformation, witnessing his early impulses without understanding their meaning. He had always carried an aura of volatility, a sense of being internally fragmented, as if he were fighting battles that no one else could see. But the instinctive discomfort he caused in some people had often been dismissed as oversensitivity or judgment. It was only in hindsight, with the clarity that comes after tragedy, that those impressions sharpened into something recognizable. In truth, his escalation followed a pattern that specialists in behavioral criminology could map almost step by step. He began with acts that hovered on the border between delinquency and deeply concerning psychological disturbance. There were moments of cruelty toward peers, incidents of unpredictable anger, obsessions with weapons, and an inability to form attachments outside of fleeting or transactional interactions. He sought attention through intimidation, but never through emotional connection. His relationships were composed of surfaces, polite exchanges with teachers that masked resentment, playful banter with peers that hid insecurity, attempts to appear normal that always fell short because he had never learned how to be fully present in the world around him. What made his case particularly dangerous was that he understood just enough about social behavior to imitate it when necessary. He could be quiet and respectful when confronted by authority, capable of producing the outward calm that made teachers believe he was simply shy. He could appear apologetic in a way that satisfied those who wanted to give him second chances. But behind that facade was a spiraling inner landscape where fantasies of domination and control grew stronger with each passing year. He did not want companionship, affection, or acceptance. He wanted the power to shape moments of fear, to rewrite the imbalance he felt in his daily life, by exerting absolute authority over someone else's body. This internal split is what allowed him to glide undetected through moments that should have raised alarms. When he was younger, adults interpreted his withdrawn manner as a sign of vulnerability, not threat. When he displayed aggression, it was seen as impulsive immaturity rather than calculated testing of boundaries. But the truth is, offenders of his type do not become violent overnight. They evolve through a series of small permissions they grant themselves. Each act of cruelty that goes unchallenged reinforces the belief that they are invisible, untouchable, and capable of operating outside normal moral limits. Claire's murder represented the culmination of this evolution. It was not a random burst of violence, but the moment when he allowed his fantasies to fully manifest. He knew the alleyway, knew the pattern of foot traffic, knew the blind spots created by the architecture of the surrounding buildings. He had walked those routes countless times, not necessarily in preparation for murder, but in the familiar way someone naturally absorbs their environment. His comfort with the area gave him confidence. He understood how quickly he could strike and how easily he could disappear afterward. Offenders strike where they feel safe, where the landscape itself feels like an extension of their own territory. That alley was his. What unsettled investigators most was how swiftly he returned to normal life afterward. The hours that followed the murder were filled not with panic or remorse, but with an eerie return to routine. This is a hallmark of a particular type of violent offender, the ability to detach from the gravity of their actions and reintegrate into daily life as though nothing had happened. It is not courage but emotional vacancy, a hollowed-out space where empathy should reside. He did not feel the weight of what he had done because the act had fulfilled a psychological need rather than violated a moral boundary. In the weeks after the crime, he observed the community's reaction with a detached curiosity. He listened to rumors, watched news reports, and noted the shifts in people's behavior. He was not afraid of being caught because he believed he had executed the attack cleanly, and for a time, he was right. There was no immediate forensic breakthrough, no eyewitness with a clear view, no sudden slip-up that exposed him. Instead, he lived quietly, feeding on the knowledge that he had reshaped the town without anyone knowing it was him. That secrecy gave him a sense of importance he had never experienced before. He attended Claire's funeral not because he cared, but because he wanted to study the aftermath. He lingered just far enough from the main gathering to avoid notice, yet close enough to observe the emotional devastation that rippled through the crowd. Some killers returned to the scene of their crimes physically, others psychologically, but he did both. Standing among the mourners, he experienced a sense of elevation, however warped, that the grief of an entire town was a direct consequence of his hidden actions. This is not remorse, it is ego. Years later, when the full truth began to surface through painstaking investigative effort, the cumulative weight of smaller incidents from his past suddenly regained their significance. Patterns that once seemed disconnected came into focus, forming a coherent trajectory of escalating violence. His earlier assaults, once dismissed or misunderstood, re-emerged as precursors to Claire's death. It became evident that he had been moving toward that moment long before he carried out the attack. Every failed intervention, every overlooked warning sign, every decision to treat his behavior as a phase rather than a symptom contributed to the space in which he operated unchecked. When investigators finally confronted him, the facade he had maintained for years began to fracture. The calmness he relied on could not withstand the pressure of evidence, nor the psychological probing that followed. He struggled to articulate his motives because, at his core, he did not understand them himself. His violence was not born from ideology, revenge, or personal conflict. It stemmed from a deep, pervasive emptiness that he tried to fill through domination. This made him all the more dangerous because he was not anchored in any stable emotional reality. He was shaped by impulses he could neither control nor fully comprehend. In the interview room, the gaps in his internal world became clearer. He spoke in fragmented phrases, often contradicting himself, as though his memories were arranged not chronologically, but emotionally, by intensity rather than sequence. He showed no understanding of the impact of his actions, no recognition of Claire as a human being. She was not a person in his recollection, but an event, a moment of fulfillment, an outlet for the turmoil he carried. Investigators noted this as a key indicator of his psychological profile. He could remember the sensory details of the crime, the rush, the precision, the aftermath, but he could not place Claire within any moral framework. She was incidental to his need, a symbol rather than a victim. As the interviews progressed, the lead detective began to see the deeper structure of his psyche. He had never developed the emotional architecture that supports empathy, remorse, or guilt. These concepts were not absent because he rejected them. They were absent because they had never formed in the first place. Most people develop these through bonds, relationships, and the natural process of interpersonal connection. But he had grown up in an emotional void, surrounded by interactions that lacked depth or trust. He learned to imitate expressions and responses, but not to internalize them. This made him socially functional, but emotionally hollow. People often imagine killers as monstrous figures devoid of humanity, but the reality is more insidious. They are often ordinary, visible, embedded in communities, moving through the world unnoticed because their external presentation masks the internal deficiencies that drive their actions. He was a prime example of this duality. He could stand in a queue, hold a conversation, follow routines, and appear unremarkable. And this normalcy is precisely what concealed the magnitude of his internal disintegration. Investigators realized that this contrast made him harder to detect, but also easier to understand. He had built his entire identity around hiding the very parts of himself that threatened to reveal who he truly was. The psychological reports that followed painted a portrait of a man shaped by long-term instability, not in overt violence, but in subtle emotional misalignment. He lacked secure attachments, viewed relationships as transactions, and responded to frustration with a disproportionate need for control. These traits formed the foundation of his later violence. When he discovered that fear gave him a powerful sense of self, he pursued it with increasing intensity. For someone who had spent most of his life feeling insignificant, the act of causing terror, of wielding life and death in a single moment, created an intoxicating surge of identity. This sensation did not fade after Claire's murder. It became the anchor around which his fractured mind revolved. As the trial approached, the community began to grapple not only with the horror of his actions, but with the long-term pattern that preceded them. Neighbors remembered moments when he seemed off-kilter, when his eyes lingered too long, when he appeared suddenly agitated without reason. Teachers recalled his early fixation on stories that glorified violence, his difficulty interpreting social cues, his disruptive mood swings. Colleagues mentioned uneasy encounters, times when he appeared to drift into a private world where the rules of ordinary interaction no longer applied. These recollections were not hindsight inventions. They were genuine fragments of a larger truth that had never been pieced together. The prosecution built its case not only on forensic evidence, but on the psychological timeline of his escalation. They showed the jury how each earlier incident foreshadowed Claire's murder, how his behavioral patterns formed a clear trajectory, how his obsession with knives was not a harmless fascination, but a manifestation of emotional turbulence that eventually found its outlet in violence. The courtroom became a mirror of everything the town had ignored or rationalized. And as the evidence unfolded, it became increasingly impossible to dismiss the idea that this tragedy could have been prevented if earlier warning signs had been recognized. Throughout the trial, he remained largely detached, observing the proceedings with an expression that hovered between confusion and resignation. He did not appear to understand the weight of the accusations, nor the magnitude of what he had taken from Claire's family. When he was shown photographs of Claire, he did not react. When witnesses described the impact of her death, he stared forward, unblinking. This absence of emotional response reinforced the diagnosis that he lacked the capacity for empathy. But for the jury, it served as a stark reminder of the kind of danger he represented. On the day the verdict was delivered, the courtroom held its breath. Claire's family sat together, hands clasped, bracing for the moment that would either validate their years of suffering or plunge them back into uncertainty. When the foreman rose and announced the verdict, a wave of emotion swept through the room, not triumph, but release. The truth had finally found its place in the world, carved out through the collective effort of psychologists, witnesses, and a community that refused to let Claire's memory fade. And yet, even with justice served, The deeper question remained, how had someone capable of such violence lived among them for so long without detection? The answer, as experts explained afterward, lay in the complexity of human behavior. Society is not conditioned to suspect those who seem merely odd, nor to interpret social discomfort as danger. Communities extend grace by default, assuming growth, change, or harmless eccentricity. But in rare cases, like his, these assumptions create the perfect camouflage for someone whose internal world is unraveling. The aftermath of the trial left many in Dartford grappling with guilt, not because they were responsible, but because they felt they should have seen what they were never trained to recognize. This emotional reckoning is common in small-town tragedies. People revisit old interactions, questioning their instincts, wondering whether a different reaction might have altered the course of events. But this is an unfair burden to place on ordinary individuals. Understanding the signs of escalating violence requires specialized knowledge, not intuition alone. Claire's family, however, carried a different kind of grief. Their loss was not abstract or philosophical. It was immediate and permanent. They had lost a daughter, a friend, a bright presence whose absence created a void no verdict could fill. Their journey through mourning was marked not only by sorrow but by the lingering question of why Claire, of all people, had crossed paths with someone so deeply broken. This question had no satisfying answer because Claire did nothing to invite danger. She was caught in the trajectory of a man whose internal chaos collided with her life in a moment that could never be undone. As the community slowly returned to normalcy, a shadow remained. Not the shadow of fear, but the shadow of understanding. An awareness of how fragile the boundary is between safety and threat, between routine and catastrophe. Dartford learned that danger does not always arrive in dramatic form. Sometimes it grows quietly, unnoticed, within someone who has mastered the art of blending into the edges of society. And when that danger finally emerges, the shock is not only in the act itself, but in the revelation of how close it had been all along. That awareness reshaped the way people looked at their surroundings. They became more observant, more protective of one another, more willing to trust their instincts. Schools began implementing programs on behavioral warning signs. Community organizations hosted talks on mental health and the importance of early intervention. Police worked to strengthen their connections with residents, encouraging them to report concerning behavior without fear of overreacting. The tragedy became a catalyst for transformation, not because it could erase what had been lost, but because it illuminated the need for vigilance rooted in compassion rather than suspicion. In the years that followed, Claire's legacy grew far beyond the circumstances of her death. Scholarships were established in her name, community events were held in her honor, and her story became a reminder of the resilience that emerges from collective grief. Her family spoke openly about their experiences, not to dwell on the pain, but to ensure that her memory inspired awareness, empathy, and the courage to confront difficult truths. Through this, Claire continued to influence the world, not as a victim, but as a symbol of the strength that arises when communities face darkness together and choose to bring light into the spaces where silence once lived. In the months that followed, the town of Dartford remained alive with the echoes of the tragedy, the ordinary rhythms of life tinged by the extraordinary violence that had pierced its quiet veneer. Schools had added programs focused on mental health awareness, teaching children to express feelings rather than suppress them, encouraging peer support, and helping educators identify students who might be struggling in silence. Parents learned to recognize subtle behavioral shifts, understanding that small signs, withdrawal, sudden outbursts, obsessive interests, could signal deeper issues. Social workers and psychologists were brought in more regularly, and local organizations offered workshops that merged safety with compassion, aiming to prevent fear from turning into paranoia. The community slowly, hesitantly, reclaimed a sense of stability. Neighbors formed tighter bonds, checking in on one another not as a reaction to terror, but as a commitment to collective care. Informal support networks flourished. People shared stories, memories, and experiences, realizing that vulnerability could be met with empathy rather than judgment. The grief of Claire's death became a connective tissue that bound the community together. It was an invisible thread of mutual understanding that grew stronger with time. Families began to discuss openly how to protect and nurture the next generation, recognizing that the tragedy had exposed weaknesses not just in individual awareness, but in societal structures that allowed emotional neglect to go unchecked. The police force, meanwhile, underwent internal changes. Officers who had worked tirelessly on the case reflected on the ways they had initially underestimated subtle behavioral cues. Standard training protocols were revised to include modules on psychological profiling, recognizing early signs of violent tendencies, and understanding the nuances of emotional dysregulation in individuals. The force invested in closer collaboration with psychologists, educators, and social workers, acknowledging that law enforcement alone could not prevent tragedies rooted in long-term mental instability. Documented their findings meticulously, creating a comprehensive resource for future cases. For the town's citizens, life moved forward in uneven rhythms. Some continued to feel fear in quiet moments. A glance at a stranger, the sound of an unlocked door, a sudden absence in the familiar bustle of daily life. Others experienced anger, frustrated by the seeming randomness of tragedy and the realization that human behavior is often unpredictable. Yet many began to embrace resilience, cultivating routines, personal safety measures, and a renewed focus on relationships that mattered. They learned that grief and vigilance could coexist, that healing was not linear, but required conscious attention and ongoing effort. Psychologists and criminologists who studied the Dartford case highlighted its broader implications. They noted that the killer's pattern of escalation was not unique, but emblematic of a broader category of offenders, individuals who function outwardly within society while nurturing internal compulsions and obsessions that remain invisible until acted upon. These individuals often evade detection not due to exceptional cunning, but because society lacks the language and frameworks to interpret their behaviors. Early intervention, they argued, was the key, not just in punitive terms, but through education, emotional literacy, and social support networks that catch the troubled before they cross thresholds that cannot be reversed. In private, Claire's family continued to navigate a complicated mix of sorrow, guilt, and determination. The grief that had once seemed insurmountable became a source of motivation. They invested in community projects, mental health initiatives, and scholarships in her name, determined that her memory would catalyze positive change. Through interviews, talks, and personal engagements, they conveyed the realities of loss in a way that was both intimate and instructive. Their willingness to transform pain into action offered a model for other families who face sudden tragedies. They demonstrated that grief could coexist with purpose, that even in the shadow of violence, one could cultivate agency and hope. The killer, incarcerated for life, remained an object of study. Psychologists and researchers examined his behavior in controlled settings, exploring the neurological and psychological underpinnings of his lack of empathy and moral reasoning. Sessions revealed that despite his superficial intelligence in social mimicry, he had never internalized moral frameworks or developed meaningful emotional bonds. Attempts at rehabilitation were met with frustration. His cognitive faculties were intact, but his affective responses were minimal. Observers noted that his case offered rare insight into the interplay between environmental neglect, early life trauma, and the formation of antisocial tendencies that culminate in extreme violence. As time passed, the town developed rituals of remembrance that reinforced both grief and resilience. Each year, on the anniversary of Claire's death, local schools and community centers hosted memorial walks, art installations, and storytelling sessions where children and adults could express themselves openly. These events became spaces not only for mourning, but for education, where narratives of safety, empathy, and awareness were shared. Parents and teachers emphasized that understanding human behavior is a lifelong process, and that fostering emotional intelligence in children was a form of preventative care. Claire's story, while tragic, became a lens through which a generation learned the fragility and value of life and the responsibilities inherent in community living. The broader societal conversation about mental health and violent behavior gained momentum in the wake of Dartford. Media coverage explored the delicate balance between personal privacy and public safety, emphasizing the need to approach psychological instability with both caution and compassion. Policymakers introduced initiatives that encouraged accessible mental health services, early childhood support programs, and the integration of psychological education into public institutions. Dartford, once known primarily for the tragedy, gradually became a case study in proactive communal care, showing that even in the wake of profound loss, societies could respond with constructive measures. Meanwhile, academic discourse around the case highlighted the complexity of human psychology. Scholars debated the intersections of nature and nurture, genetic predisposition versus environmental shaping, and the ways in which unaddressed emotional deficits can compound over time into dangerous behaviors. They emphasized the importance of longitudinal observation, monitoring patterns from early childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood, to identify risk factors before they culminate in catastrophic acts. Dartford's tragedy became a reference point for such research, illustrating the consequences of subtle misalignments between individual psychology and societal structures. Even the arts reflected the impact of the event. Writers, filmmakers, and artists interpreted Clare's story through various lenses, exploring themes of loss, vulnerability, resilience, and moral ambiguity. These interpretations were not exploitative. Rather, they contributed to the ongoing dialogue about human complexity, societal responsibility, and emotional literacy. By embedding the tragedy into broader cultural consciousness, the story remained alive not as a sensational headline, but as a moral and emotional compass, guiding reflection on ethical, social, and psychological questions. Gradually, Dartford itself transformed. Streets once heavy with fear became pathways of cautious optimism. Community meetings addressed not only safety protocols, but the cultivation of social bonds. Neighbors engaged in regular check-ins, not out of suspicion, but out of care. Teachers prioritized the emotional well-being of students alongside academic achievement. Families learned that vigilance was not merely a reaction to danger, but an expression of love, connection, and shared responsibility. Clare's death, while irreplaceable, had catalyzed a form of communal awakening that would endure for generations. Within the prison, the killer's existence became a routine study of stability and pathology. Guards noted his meticulous adherence to institutional rules, his withdrawal into solitary routines, and his obsession with order. Psychologists tracked his responses to stimuli, finding patterns of detachment and occasional bursts of irritability. These observations reinforced the idea that his emotional architecture was fundamentally altered, that the experiences of normal human attachment and moral development had failed to imprint meaningfully. He remained a living study of antisocial cognition, a cautionary example of the human potential for harm when early interventions fail. Outside the walls of the institution, the ripple effects of the case continued. The legal system began to integrate psychological profiling more rigorously into criminal investigations. Schools across the region adopted emotional literacy curricula. Social workers and counselors were trained to recognize early signs of distress and escalate concerns appropriately. Communities learned that preventing tragedy required proactive engagement, not reactive lamentation. Clare's story, though tragic, became a blueprint for a society striving to understand the intersection of human behavior, emotional neglect, and social responsibility. The quiet, enduring lesson of Dartford was that tragedy does not always strike randomly. It emerges from identifiable patterns, gaps in care, and missed opportunities for intervention. While not all potential dangers can be anticipated, the story underscored the power of awareness, connection, and community vigilance. Clare's life and death, examined in the context of these patterns, offered insight into the fragility of human systems and the extraordinary capacity for humans to adapt, respond, and nurture safety once the underlying truths are acknowledged. Even years later, visitors to Dartford noted a subtle transformation in the town's atmosphere. Children played openly in supervised parks, adults engaged in active mentorship programs, and community centers buzzed with workshops on safety, empathy, and mental health. The town's narrative had shifted from victimhood to vigilance, from grief to proactive care. While scars remained, both visible and invisible, the collective consciousness had been reshaped. Claire's presence in memory and influence permeated this transformation, turning the deepest tragedy into a lasting catalyst for communal resilience, awareness, and compassion. Time continued its relentless march, and with it, Dartford's story became woven into layers of lived experience and cultural memory. The initial shock, raw and unfiltered, had matured into a reflective, almost solemn awareness. Families who had once feared stepping out at dusk now walk streets with careful confidence, teaching children not just about danger, but about discernment and intuition. Emotional literacy programs in schools expanded to include practical exercises, recognizing microexpressions, understanding nonverbal cues, and discussing moral dilemmas. Students learned that empathy and vigilance could coexist, that safety was not merely about avoidance, but about engagement with the world in an informed, aware way. The local council initiated a multi-year mental health initiative, collaborating with universities and health organizations to establish permanent community clinics. These clinics offered workshops, counseling, and therapeutic sessions tailored for children, adolescents, and adults. The emphasis was on proactive care, identifying early signs of distress, teaching coping strategies, and creating spaces where open communication was encouraged. It became a model adopted by neighboring towns, showing that an investment in mental well-being could transform collective resilience. Health workers reported increased engagement from families, noting that people were not just seeking support in crises, but were willing to participate in ongoing preventive programs. In homes across Dartford, ordinary routines began to shift subtly. Conversations at dinner tables included reflections on feelings, discussions about conflicts, and shared problem solving. Parents encouraged children to voice anxieties and uncertainties, modeling emotional transparency themselves. Adolescents participated in peer support groups, learning to navigate the complexities of social hierarchies and interpersonal tensions with guidance from trained facilitators. Families found that cultivating emotional intelligence, rather than suppressing fears, created stronger bonds and a deeper sense of security. The town, once fractured by tragedy, gradually nurtured a culture of empathy and observation. The annual memorials for Clare evolved into forums for education and storytelling. Students would write essays reflecting on resilience, teachers facilitated group discussions about moral responsibility, and community members shared their experiences of overcoming fear or responding to crises. These events were not mere ceremonial gestures, but active engagements with the concepts of empathy, safety, and communal vigilance. Local artists contributed murals and installations that visually represented both loss and hope, making the lessons tangible. The story of Clare became less a tale of victimhood and more a living guide for ethical and emotional awareness. Academia remained deeply invested in the Dartford case. Sociologists, psychologists, and criminologists conducted longitudinal studies to understand both the killer's behavior and the community's response. They examined patterns of neglect, social disconnection, and early warning signs, producing research that informed policies nationwide. Workshops were conducted for law enforcement, educators, and social workers, translating the findings into actionable protocols. It became increasingly clear that the town's recovery was as much about structural adaptation, schools, law enforcement, community programs, as it was about individual resilience. Dartford's experience illustrated the interplay between social infrastructure and human psychology, offering a blueprint for preventing future tragedies in similarly vulnerable communities. The prison system's approach to the killer remained cautious but meticulously documented. Behavioral psychologists observed him in controlled environments, noting his rigid adherence to rules, minimal social engagement, and sporadic emotional outbursts. Reports underscored the difficulty of rehabilitation in cases of entrenched antisocial behavior. Yet these observations provided valuable insights for risk assessment and management strategies in correctional institutions. The case emphasized the importance of understanding individual pathology, not just for punishment, but for societal learning, reinforcing the need for systemic vigilance. Beyond Dartford, the case influenced broader public consciousness. Media outlets shifted focus from sensationalism to informative narratives, emphasizing prevention, understanding, and mental health awareness. Documentaries, podcasts, and educational programs explored the dynamics of hidden violence, the importance of early intervention, and the societal responsibilities inherent in collective care. The narrative of Dartford became a touchstone for communities nationwide, illustrating the profound effects of awareness, communication, and structured emotional support. Within Dartford, the ordinary rhythm of life gained a renewed texture. Streets were patrolled not just by police, but by engaged citizens participating in neighborhood watch programs. Local businesses collaborated with schools and social organizations to sponsor mentorship initiatives, combining economic and social investment in communal well-being. Adults who had once felt helpless in the face of tragedy now assumed active roles as mentors, volunteers, and advocates. The community's cohesion became both a shield and a testament to human adaptability, demonstrating that proactive engagement can transform grief into constructive action. Families, especially those who had lost children or had been directly impacted, found new purpose in advocacy. Parent groups were formed to lobby for policy changes, integrating mental health curricula in schools and expanding access to counseling services. These initiatives, grounded in lived experience, carried a weight of authenticity that academic research alone could not provide. Survivors' voices shaped policy, practice, and pedagogy, ensuring that lessons were translated into actionable, lasting change. Emotional resilience was cultivated alongside social responsibility, creating a holistic model of recovery. The town's educational institutions became central to the narrative of ongoing transformation. Teachers, equipped with advanced training in emotional literacy, guided students through exercises that fostered self-awareness, ethical reasoning, and empathy. Conflict resolution workshops allowed students to explore complex scenarios, practicing negotiation, perspective-taking, and moral judgment. Through these programs, young people internalize the principles of vigilance and care, understanding that safety is both an individual and collective responsibility. Dartford's schools emerged as incubators of moral and emotional intelligence, shaping a generation attuned to both their own needs and the needs of others. Cultural initiatives complemented these educational efforts. Theater productions, art exhibitions, and literary projects engaged with the community's experiences, transforming collective memory into creative expression. These artistic interpretations offered opportunities for reflection, discussion, and empathy building, reinforcing lessons that were otherwise abstract. By embedding the tragedy within a framework of artistic dialogue, the town ensured that memory did not stagnate in fear, but evolved into understanding, insight, and motivation for communal vigilance. Psychologists observed a notable shift in public perception over the years. Initially dominated by fear and suspicion, attitudes gradually embraced proactive empathy. Citizens recognized that understanding human behavior, especially deviations that signal potential harm, is not about judgment or fear-mongering, but about informed engagement. Dartford's population learned that moral and emotional literacy, community vigilance, and structured support systems could significantly mitigate risks, transforming collective anxiety into resilience. The tragedy's imprint, though indelible, became a catalyst for cognitive and emotional growth across generations. Even the local economy benefited indirectly. Businesses engaged in community programs, workshops, and mentorship initiatives, creating environments that encourage interaction, learning, and trust. Civic engagement became intertwined with commerce, as enterprises recognized the value of contributing to social well-being. In this way, economic vitality and communal resilience reinforced each other, creating a feedback loop that strengthened both material and social infrastructure. Dartford, once known primarily for its tragedy, became a model of integrated community development, where social consciousness and practical action coexisted. As the years advanced, the collective memory of the tragedy maintained its dual nature, a cautionary tale and a source of constructive transformation. Residents acknowledged the pain and the loss, yet actively celebrated the community's growth, resilience, and cohesion. Clare's story, preserved through memorials, education, and cultural engagement, remained a touchstone for ethical reflection and emotional literacy. Her life and death had catalyzed not only grief, but a conscious effort to reshape human behavior, communal bonds, and societal structures. Dartford evolved into a town where tragedy had sparked awareness, vigilance, and the cultivation of empathy as civic virtues. The enduring lesson for Dartford, and by extension, for any community confronting similar challenges, was clear. Vigilance, empathy, and proactive care are interdependent. A society that invests in emotional literacy, communal cohesion, and early intervention reduces the likelihood of preventable tragedies. Claire's story, though tragic, became a blueprint for awareness and resilience, demonstrating the transformative potential of tragedy when approached with reflection, compassion, and structured action. It was a reminder that while human behavior can be unpredictable, communities have the capacity to learn, adapt, and protect themselves through knowledge, empathy, and vigilance. In the end, Dartford's identity was irrevocably altered. Where fear once dominated, understanding and vigilance now prevailed. Where grief had threatened to paralyze, it became a catalyst for action. The town's story, marked by tragedy but defined by resilience, reflected the enduring human potential to transform loss into learning, chaos into structure, and vulnerability into collective strength. Claire's memory lived on, not as a shadow over the town, but as a guiding principle, ensuring that the lessons of the past were never forgotten and that the future, while uncertain, was approached with care, awareness, and unyielding empathy. And that's the story for today. If you found it gripping, insightful, or thought-provoking, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. Join the conversation and help us grow this community of true crime enthusiasts. Make sure to subscribe to Silent Witness Archives so you never miss another story. Your support keeps these stories alive.